Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Legacy Speaks. We are in the midst of an interesting time in which so many issues regarding mental illness are being pushed to the forefront. I'm challenging myself to dig a little bit deeper to bring you guys content that covers all aspects of mental health. So today we're going to focus on something that is not so taboo but highly overlooked, which is male survivors of sexual trauma. By shedding light on this topic, my hope is to help foster positive dialogue about something that we often fail to confront head on. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I need you to hit that subscription button below, that way you can stay up to date on newly released content on a regular basis. One of the most important myths that I want to dispel is the idea that males, and I'm talking boys and men, can be victims of sexual violence. Just briefly, I want to introduce a few key terms because if we're going to advocate for mental health, we need to start using the appropriate terminology. Sexual violence is a term that is the umbrella for other dynamics such as sexual assault, sexual abuse, molestation, rape, sexual harassment, and so on, all of which can lay way to sexual trauma, which is our focus for today. Studies show that 1 in 6 males before the age of 24 experience sexual violence, and even then, we have to tread lightly with that statistic because many cases go unreported. And there are reasons for that. First being the way that both state and local government laws define sexual abuse and rape. Our society's twisted perspective regarding sexual abuse and rape culture greatly influences lawmakers, and we see that in the way that we approach the issue. When a child, adolescent, or adult male comes forward to seek justice for their sexual trauma, they're often told to have several seats, especially if the perpetrator is a woman. I mean, who wouldn't want to be taken advantage of by a woman, right? If it's a child or a teen, it's seen as a rite of passage, an opportunity for a boy to become a man, so to speak. Even if it's an adult-on-adult offense, unwanted and unwarranted advances from the opposite sex are seen as the ultimate fantasy. Any man who objects needs to grow some balls or take it like a man, or just shut up and go along with it. We see the gender bias in news coverage and the comments on social media when the latest female teacher, supervisor, CEO, or woman in position of power sexually assaults a guy, and the assailant is given a slight reprimanding, if that, and the guys high five, and then everyone goes about their business. Let the roles reverse where the male is the perpetrator and the female is the victim. News tabloids, pitchforks, and entire movements occur. The unfairness really grinds my gears, and I'm low-key getting worked up about this, especially when it comes to the Me Too movement. If we're going to put an end to sexual violence, don't just limit the scope to women being victims or survivors. For women to tell men survivors of sexual abuse to basically shut up, this is about us, let us have our moment, is ridiculous and insensitive. It's absolutely anti-feminist for all of you fake feminists, yes, I said it, because we blame men for not supporting our efforts in equality but won't allow men who empathize and sympathize with our struggles to speak on them. All I'm saying is when it comes to reprimanding perpetrators, there needs to be fairness across the board, regardless of gender, race, and socioeconomic status. A female perpetrator needs to receive the same amount of punishment and scrutiny as males who commit sexual violence. The second reason why many cases are underreported is because of the way sexual abuse and rape are defined within our communities and even within our families. Like female counterparts, plenty of male individuals are disbelieved, especially when the assailant is a family member, a friend, or someone that is perceived to have good character, like a teacher or a religious leader. Oftentimes, family members will protect the perpetrator rather than treating that individual as a sexual abuser, so that this uncomfortable information doesn't create disruption in the home or bring shame on the family's name. By doing so, this sends two messages. One, the perpetrator can get away with it, and two, the victim doesn't gain anything from telling the truth. And let me tell you, the maladaptive behavior of a sexual predator is reinforced when the people around them knows that what is happening is wrong but fail to confront and reprimand them. This can be seen in the documentary What Haunts Us, which I encourage all of you guys to see. It highlights the scandal in which an athletic director, Eddie Fisher, and school principal James Bishop Alexander at Portugal went through years of sexually abusing the boys that went to that school. The crazy thing is there were several people in the community who knew about it and said absolutely nothing. This led to a pattern of deaths by suicide for 6 former students that graduated from the 1979 class. I think a parent went to the headmaster to tell him what was going on, and the school administration continued to allow this man to run rampant, even allowing him to retire and transfer schools where he was able to continue abusing male students. It wasn't until one of his survivors, Gary Glover, spoke out in adulthood with the help of his father filing a civil suit. I went to a session at the 2018 ACA conference entitled Hiding in Plain Sight, Treatment Considerations for Male Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse. And one thing that stood out from the presentation when James Smith and Greg Holtmeyer stated men aren't given the right to be victims. And that falls on the idea that masculinity is exempt from any sign of weakness or vulnerability. They're expected to lick their own wounds and continue on with life. Even further, most men are not okay with conceptualizing themselves as falling prey to someone else, especially if it's with regards to being a victim of sexual abuse. Oftentimes, there is this immediate questioning of their sexuality or an automatic assumption that they are gay, and that happens both internally and externally if they happen to disclose. Some questions that I personally heard when doing therapy is like, well, I got an erection. I didn't want it to happen. Does that mean that I liked it? Does that mean that I wanted it? What about me causes man to want to do these things to me? And we can see the same internal dialogue with female survivors as well. So in retrospect, male survivors of sexual trauma are challenged with the fear of being condemned, having their masculinity challenged, or having their sexuality questioned. Yes, guys have to deal with victim blaming too. And because of this, guilt, which is the idea that I did something bad, and shame, which is I am bad, creates the inability to express what happened. Going back to the Porter Gout situation as an example, one of the reasons why Eddie Fisher was able to get away with it for so many years is because his victims went on to become some of the most top-notch in their field and had already come from prominent families within the Charlotte, South Carolina community. You know how it is in the South. Anything that even hints at ruffling a little bit of feathers remains unspoken and unaddressed. So for those who went on to become doctors, lawyers, and the upper echelon of the city, the idea of coming out as a survivor of childhood sexual trauma posed as a risk to their reputations and livelihood. Being molested is already traumatic as it is, but being a male who is molested by another male takes it up a notch. And the idea of losing that status that they worked so hard to acquire in spite of what was done to them is frightening. Survivors of sexual trauma go on to have new lives and build families of their own, but are still bogged with this weight from the secrets they carry. Will their spouse understand? What will happen if their kids found out? What does this mean for their career or their business? That's why it's so important to foster healthy dialogue so that people can stop being afraid to speak out. With regards to signs and risk factors, this population is often prone to higher risk of drug and alcohol abuse, PTSD, and suicidality. There is also an emphasis on hyper-masculinity or engaging in activities that exert that they are manly as a way to overcompensate for what happened to them. This includes but is not limited to aggressive and impulsive behaviors, promiscuity or having multiple sexual partners, or even seeking employment in high-risk industries like the military, police force, and so on. And don't misquote me. I'm not saying that every guy who experiences sexual trauma goes into these fields, but there is a trend. So now that we talked about the presenting issues, signs, and risk factors, it's highly important that we explore solutions. Highly. There goes. Sorry, I was like, oh my gosh, girl, that came from like the back of my throat, honey. Like what Hylam? I'm like, Lord have mercy. It is highly important that we explore solutions. We can talk about problems all day, but we have to be people of action. First, we have to create opportunities for survivors to share their experiences. You think getting a child to talk about their trauma is difficult? Try getting a full-grown man to do the same thing. It is natural for human beings to share with someone that they can trust and feel safe with. Whether you're a parent, spouse, coworker, or friend, aim to be a positive support system by being mindful of your reactions and maintaining confidentiality. The only time you should be sharing this information with others is if you feel like they are in a state of possibly harming themselves or other people. Utilize positive reaffirming language to reduce the feelings of guilt and shame. Remember, no victim shaming or blaming. Your goal is to be an active listener and allow them to lead the course of the conversation. When I was working with my first ever male survivor of sexual abuse, I just let him talk the first time he shared because I was probably like the only person he ever told within decades. So rather than miss that moment and immediately jump in to try to get him to reflect on his presenting problem, I worked to create an atmosphere that was both safe and judgment free. The second one is pretty simple and straightforward. Believe. With any child, whether it's a male, female, or non-binary individual, please believe them. Especially if it's a child, believe first and then investigate second, because nothing's worse than trying to muster up the courage to share a traumatic experience only to be told that you're a liar by someone who wasn't even there. Third, allow the male survivor to self-define the experience initially, which is something that I didn't even think of until I went to Greg and James's education session. I know at the beginning I noted terms like sexual abuse, sexual violence, etc. After we've finally gotten our loved one to a place where they can talk about it, don't rush to label it as sexual abuse unless that's how they personally define it. Like I mentioned, not all men will see themselves as survivors of sexual abuse or even label their experiences as sexual trauma. Peeling back those layers and working through them is a process, and with the help of a mental health professional and your support, they'll become more comfortable with the idea of calling it what it is. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Legacy Speaks. I hope that this wasn't a lot. I have included additional resources in the description box below, as well as the contact information of James Smith and Greg Holtmeyer, because the work that they are doing with regards to male sexual trauma survivors is amazeballs. Pun intended. Let's keep the conversation going. What can we do to help male survivors find their voice in the efforts to address sexual abuse? Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. And don't forget to stay connected via Legacy SBKS on everything. Until next time.
Thank you.